This first chapter of Mark is, I think, a very bold statement of who God is. Let me put it in context. How many of you have heard when you're out and about or socializing or at a sporting event or a musical event or just sitting around at a coffee table, someone assess the minister, whether it be myself or others, but we evaluate the pastor. People do that all the time. Are you aware that clergy evaluate congregations? Are you aware that we get way broader press than you do? Because all I have to do is sit in a group with 20 other clergy, and I'm going to touch 100 clergy just by a sentence. So an evaluation from both sides takes place every single time. First, things matter. First impressions matter. And it all depends upon what you're looking for. When Terry Fulham went to a church up in Connecticut, some people saw this very large, imposing man, a professor in a university, Brown University, a teacher of religion, and they heard him speak, and he rolled things out somewhat slowly, and he built up steam, and he really simply asked in his first sermon, "Who do you say Jesus is?" So by the end, some were intimidated because of this imposing man, clearly an intelligent man, articulate man, never looked down. He just had them in his arms, and he spoke to them, and he asked them the most important question of all. Who is Jesus to you? Evaluations. It's what you bring to the table. Do you ever sit in a room full of students and adults, and you know that the students are listening for one thing and they're hearing the same speech, but they're hearing one thing and the adults are hearing another thing? Is it because of experience or lack of? You know, somebody who's 92 started to talk to me about TikTok, I'd automatically think they've got a grandfather clock in their house. But if it were a 9-year-old in my presence, I'd know there's some kind of a social media platform that's being used that I don't use and I don't know how to use. With all that in mind, the Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, Jesus and his disciples went to Capernaum. And when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. He went to church. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Just then there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. The gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. First thing I'd like to do is say to you, thank you again. This past week, I received a few dozen more cards upon the death of my mother. They're very touching. It's interesting because the cards I received within 24 hours after her death were touching. I was in Mexico. I was with our team. And it was really powerful to receive these cards coming through on my email, on my cell phone. I'm reading these delivered through email cards of condolence and concern. I've been profoundly touched by the texts and the emails that I'm receiving, sensitive to the loss of a parent. Many of the people have sent me cards have sent us cards, I should say, to my whole family, speak of their own loss And there is a connecting link there for us. Some have said you need to take care of yourself because you don't show as much as maybe you would expect me to show. Well, I'm at work. I came to do a job, and I came to do what I've been purposed to do. It doesn't mean that I'm not feeling, because of course I am. It'll probably come out in the sermon today, because the sermon has a lot to do with thinking and feeling and the connection of the two. Have you received your newsletter? How many of you haven't yet? For those of you who have, and for those of you who are aware, in my cover sheet for the newsletter, it invites you to participate in what came out of our Wednesday evening meeting a few weeks ago. Was that last week? That was last week, that last Wednesday, 2 weeks ago. But we had a meeting where folks came to the lower level, and folks that lead teams and folks that are involved at the council level, staff level. And they said, what about sharing the spiritual gift assessment tool that we've used in the past with the whole congregation? We've always invited the whole congregation, but much more intentionally this time. So the link is there. You can cut and paste it. You can write it down. You can type it into your browser. But I'm asking you to do the spiritual gift assessment tool so that we can coordinate our ministries. How many of you filled out time and talent sheets in the past? They're funny, aren't they? When they're used, they're great. When they're not used, they're just a train wreck, because what they create is mistrust. If you fill one out and nobody calls you, you wonder, why wasn't I called? So these things, you're immediately called because you have to be. When you fill this out, it directs us as a staff, it directs us as leaders in the congregation to know where your investments are and where this little assessment tool reveals hidden gifts that you might not even know you have. I have one in my hands right now. I would not invite this person to be a part of art in our congregation because on a scale of 1 to 12, they are a 2. I would not invite this person to be a part of an instrumental or band or orchestra with us because they're a 2 and not a 12. But when it comes to faith, they're a 12. They hit it out of the ballpark. Intercession, knowledge, they're an 11. So what do you think this person's connection is? And here's the really cool part. I know who this is. I know where they're involved. And they are absolutely involved in the most critical of ministries for our congregation because they are a part of face-to-face praying with others, bringing Jesus to others, meeting with others, taking communion to others, and they do it not because they want to feel good by themselves or someone adores them now because they've done that. They're doing it because they believe bringing Jesus and talking about Jesus with the other person is what's most important. I am crawling out of my skin with excitement. That's what we've been striving to do. First things first. First things first. And that is a first thing first with gold stars. Yesterday, I popped into worship team at the very beginning, had a few words, and I left. And then I popped in at the very end 3 hours later, and I don't even think I said a few words. I think I just saw their faces, and their faces said, leave. And so I left. I heard work going on that reveals who they are, their strengths, and how they believe God wants to impact and how they're going to be involved in joining with God and impacting this congregation. This text today in the first chapter of Mark, clearly God is standing against any forces that keep the people of God down. In this text, God is opposed to anything and everything that robs people of joy, of abundant life. Clearly, in this text, God is prepared to do battle through the cross, through the resurrection, through God's Spirit working in the lives of people, so that they can know that there is joy and meaning and purpose. And it's not just, I went to church, but it's, I went to church, I learned about God, I experienced God, I shared my love for God. It was reciprocal, it wasn't just one-sided. And in that experience, that's why worship was such a glorious event for me to listen in on yesterday. That's why listening to Wellspring Caritas and watching our students lead that 6-day program in Mexico was critical. We can trust our young ones. They do know. They can learn. Do they know what we know as adults? Oftentimes, how could they? Why would we expect that? It's the mutual, the reciprocal, the mentoring, the discipleship that's so critical. It's working together intergenerationally to bring it all together so that that work of experiencing what's going on in that particular organization where they see a need and they ask, can we help and how can we help? And then they participate. They participate without the assumption, we've got something that you don't have, so therefore, of course, you will want what we have. They do not do that. This group looked, listened, observed, and then said, can we help you? How can we help you? Do you hear the difference? Big, big, big difference. Big difference. I can't wait for Eloise, my little 4.5-month-old great niece, to say to me as I go to reach for a cup or go to reach for a spoon, I can do it. I'm looking forward to hearing that because that will be an expression of what I just talked about. The unclean spirit is not a mental illness. It's not to be understood as perhaps Reformation thinking 500 years ago. This text was interpreted 1,500 years after the event happened. 1,500 years for the first time we see in written books and texts and sermons a different way of looking at the unclean spirit. And all of a sudden it was all about mental illness. It's not what we're talking about here. In fact, we don't really know what we're talking about here, but we do know and we can imagine the impact of an unclean spirit. We can imagine the impact and the effect on a person's life if they have an unclean spirit. What about those things that are unclean? What about those things that rob us of abundant life? What are those things that take away the joy and the meaning and the purpose of our lives? Does an addiction add or take away from the purpose of an individual's life? Does a loss of gainful employment add or take away from a person's life? How about unsafe working conditions? Does that add or take away from a person's life? Lack of housing, food, medical treatment, does that enhance or does it diminish a person's life? God says, not only is that wrong, but I want you, the body of Christ, with your hands and your feet, to participate in alleviating that suffering. God says, I want you to do that. Again, Martin Luther's time, the age of the Reformation, that's when the phrase was written into the books and into the surveys and into the studies and into the sermons, that God came for us. And somehow it got distorted. It devolved into God came for only us. God came for only those who think or act like us. Can any of you say that you've experienced anything like that in church? God came for those people, but not for those people. God came for us because we have. Clearly, they don't have, so they must not have. Do you ever see somebody that is in torn and tattered clothing and they smell, they stink? And have you looked at them with the same loving and adoring eyes as you would someone in clearly cleaned up, just fresh out of the spa and in phenomenal clothes? Do you look at them the same way? Do you wear your Sunday best to church, and do you leave your gardening clothes at home? So you get to do that, but what about the people that don't have a change of clothing to even get into, or to have shoes. How many pairs of shoes do you have? How many different pairs of shoes do you have? I've got shoes, the uppers are identical, but the lowers are not. Leather soles when I'm in here on a dry day, but a rubberized sole when I'm at a funeral because I'm going to be out in the grass and I'm going to get wet. Can you imagine having more than one pair of shoes? How many of you have more than 10 pair of shoes? Yeah, I know. So that's our starting point. But that's not to shame you or to embarrass you, and those are really lousy ways of doing things. How much money do you give to the church? You only give this much? You spend more on your pet each week than you do in your contribution to church. That kind of shaming has no place in the Christian church. Now, if it's a fact, it's a fact, but there's no place in a Christian ministry. What does have a place in the Christian ministry from this first chapter of Mark is that God is here for us always, and that first things really do, first things matter. When I arrived back in 2015, does anybody remember the very, very, very first thing that I announced that I would do with you? Does anybody remember in April of 2015, in fact, it was the second Sunday I was here, I said, this is where I think we need to go, and this is what I think we need to improve, and this is what I think we need to work on. And then within 30 days, we actually started. There's a picture. I have a picture of the group of people that actually started it. And the project started with an Eagle Scout. Not for nothing, but Eagle Scouts get stuff done. Sometimes because they have to if they want to become an Eagle Scout, and sometimes because it's just in their blood, you got to do it. Do you not remember what we did? We cleaned up what? The preschool. Because 98% of people who come to know Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior and live out Christian faith, 98% say that it happened before they reach the age of 18. Now, the fact that they fall away, the fact that they drift away, the fact that they don't have enough background or education or training to raise them up in the way that they should go, that's an indictment on those of us that call ourselves funny plastic collars, because we've got a responsibility to work with people to make sure that that actually happens. 2% of people over the age of 18 come into a vibrant faith with Jesus Christ. I experienced a person less than a year ago who was in their late 80s, and while they attended church almost every Sunday, while they were involved in everything, including the highest of leadership value places, they said they didn't really have a personal, vibrant relationship with God until this in their very last year. That's a powerful statement, but that's one of 2% that actually get there, because we can get these barriers secreted over us through the years, and we get dusty and dirty and tarnished, and we forget. And that's why it's absolutely crucial that we invest in a preschool, and that preschool has a faith-based orientation. Most people currently between the ages of 18 and 30 don't really have a faith connection. In fact, they'll work hard at saying, I don't really believe that. Atheist, agnostic, give me all the alphabet letters you can possibly give. But they don't have that. Yet they may have been raised in a family. They may have been taught. But it's not there? Oh, I don't know if it's there or not. It could just be abject disobedience. It could just being blind. It could be, it's the way that they're finally working out their adolescence, because we've prolonged adolescence. Adolescence is no longer for teenagers. Adolescence, clearly, the research says, is between 20s and 30s. So what do you do when that's when adolescence is actually happening? And the acting out is they're no longer teenagers, but you're getting that in their first jobs, their first careers. How many of you work with first career people? How many of you have had folks in their early 20s, mid-20s show up for a job that you're their supervisor? How do you experience them? Maybe you're lucky enough to hire the ones that are highly motivated. It's no different in the Christian faith. How many people did Jesus approach when he was teaching and preaching? And how many thousands came to hear him teach? And how many stayed behind? And how many left? It's an interview process in some ways. How many stick around because they want to grow in their faith? Now, all of what I've just said isn't really teaching you anything other than the research. Now let me actually move to teaching. The teaching part is the gospel writer Mark points out the very first thing he talks about. You've got the lesson in front of you. The very first thing Mark chooses to say. Matthew, Luke, and John don't. But the very first thing Mark chooses to say is, on the Sabbath. That's the same thing as saying it's Sunday. On Sunday, Jesus went and taught. Well, teaching takes place on Sundays. They were astounded at his teaching because he taught with one having authority, not like the scribes teach. Does that mean the scribes didn't have any authority? Of course they had authority, but something was different about this teaching with Jesus. And then what does he do? He doesn't stick to the teaching part. Mark goes right to the very first thing. Mark says there was a person there that had an unclean spirit. It wasn't an unclean person. There was a person that had a problem, and Jesus simply met the need. Period. It's the first thing Mark wants to teach us. And Mark wants it to be crystal clear to the readers even 2,000 years later. We see a need, we do what we can to assist. We see a need, we do whatever it takes to meet the need. For us, we feed a lot of people. Well, they have need, they don't have need. We don't know, we don't care. If you come for a meal, we'll give you a meal. Yeah, but I want to see proof that they actually need it. Tough. Proof is all they need is this. I'm hungry. Give me something to eat. Give them something to eat. But it's a day of rest. The Jewish tradition was you don't do that stuff on the Sabbath. Jesus said, your rules stink. The need's in front of you now. If the leg has fallen off, you don't wait till Monday morning, do you? You go to the urgent care. No, you don't. You go right to the emergency department because urgent care is not going to do anything. Just saying. And here's the really cool part. Did Jesus rebuke the man with the unclean spirit? Did he yell at the man with the unclean spirit? No. Jesus knew the promise of the Father was to be there for that person. And Jesus takes on the obstacle that was preventing that person, that man, from being involved with himself, accepting himself, loving himself appropriately, his family. Because what would his family do if he had an unclean spirit? What would his family be thinking other people were thinking? What would this man think that other people are thinking? Jesus goes to the heart of the matter, and he repairs it. He does it because he's the Son of God? Yes. He also does it because it's the right thing to do. I am not the Son of God, yet I know that when a person's in need, we should do something about it. I'm not Jesus Christ, and I know. So if I can know, how much more can we know as the body of Christ gathered here at St. John's? Who's suffering? Who's suffering today? Pick up your phone and call them. Who's suffering? Write a note. Your notes to me have kept me moving through these past few weeks. Your notes to me kept my eye on the game when we were down in Mexico. Your notes to me were treasured. Thank you. Now, what'd you get out of the sermon? Anybody? I'll repeat what you say. First impressions matter. Stand up. First impressions matter. How many of you are looking at Melissa, and how many of you are recalling what she said from the lectern? How many of you should have seen your faces. I think we probably have it on camera because I'm sure not only was the camera working this way, but the other way, and we record all that stuff. Be really fun for you to see what I saw. Because see, they look at one person up here or two or three of us up here. We look at them. They doodle like they don't think we doodle about them, right? Of course. They were beaming. They were beaming. They were happy to see you up there because you were at one point, not too long ago, a little rugrat running around this place. And now, it still are. Yeah, you're on the floor more now than you were back then. Yeah, you should see her in class. Kathy's back here, or I'd have Kathy tell you all about how Melissa teaches. Martha, Vicky, seriously? Do you remember when you thought, this is going to be trouble coming? Well, that's what we've got, right? She's teaching them all those bad little things, those little 2-year-olds. What did you hear in the message? First things matter, yes. Meet the need, yes. Care for one another. Well, care for those of us who are like us. Oh, yeah, but I like doing that. We should help everyone. All right, well, you help everyone. I don't want to be around those stinky people. We're trying. Yeah, it's a tough one to respond to when I do that, isn't it? Yeah. Now, hey, wait a minute. I'm going to be on a men's retreat this Friday night. Let me tell you what stinky's going to be. You're all wondering, aren't you? Anything else? I feel cared for. Yeah. First things first. What was the first thing I said? First 2 words. Thank you. Yeah.